Mercedes-Benz is one of the oldest and most luxurious automotive companies in the world with a value of around 80. It all started with a poor engineer who faced many doubts and failures in his quest to build the first horseless carriage despite his challenges proving everyone wrong, and turned his small business into the world's first and largest automobile production company in the late 19th century. But what started out as an inspiring success story took a surprisingly dark turn when the company profited from the Nazi supply of military planes under the labor of forced laborers. So sit down and relax. So sit back and relax, because today we will cover the crazy story of Mercedes-Benz and the man who brought cars to life. Carl Benz. Carl Benz was born in 1844 in the German town of Nberg into a lower-class home. His father was a locomotive driver who barely managed to support his family enough to survive. However, when Carl was 2 years old, his father passed away. He and his mother found themselves in a desperate financial situation. Needless to say, Carl's childhood was not an easy one, but despite living in poverty, he and his mother found themselves in dire financial straits. Despite living in poverty and going to bed on an empty stomach, his mother did everything she could to make sure her son had a good education. Carl was able to attend school and showed signs of brilliance at a very early age, especially in chemistry and mechanics. When he turned 15, Carl decided to follow in his father's footsteps and passed the entrance exam for mechanical engineering at the University of Karlsruhe, where he met a teacher who would eventually play an important role in his life. Ferdinand Redenbacher is regarded as a leading figure who transformed mechanical engineering from a workshop-based profession to a technical science in Germany, and was a great believer that the steam engines that were mainly used for railroads and ships at the time were fast becoming a thing of the past. Under his teaching, Carl's interest in horseless carriages really began to take off, and being a regular cyclist himself, he began to play with his bicycle, experimenting with the possible ways he could create a motorized vehicle. By then, many engineers and inventors had already tried to create the first automobile, and although some of them had already tried to create the first car, they had already tried to create the first car. Carl noticed that most of these vehicles were built with steam engines, and influenced by his professor Redenbacher, he realized the need for a totally different concept. While many people laughed at his vision, he always believed it was possible. He just needed more time to prove it. So after graduating from Karlsruhe at the age of 19, Benz spent the next 7 years working in various engineering and construction jobs, and while struggling to fit the concept into his life, he was able to create the first motorized vehicle and construction. And while struggling to fit in well in any of them, he took all he learned to start his own company. In 1871, at the age of 27, he partnered with a mechanic named August Ritter, and together they began operating an iron foundry and machine shop in Mannheim. At the same time, Benz continued to work in parallel, experimenting with a motorized carriage, so having a partner to help manage the business seemed very essential. Unfortunately, his business partner turned out to be unreliable, and after the local authorities seized his tools, the company struggled immensely. During its first year. Fortunately, Carl had also met a woman by the name Berta Rainer, who would become his wife a few years later. Born into a wealthy family, Berta was a woman of strong values and could not bear to see her fiancé's efforts wasted by her business partner, so she decided to use her own dowry to buy out Ritter's entire share in the company, which put her and Carl in total control of the business. Together they were able to turn the situation around and kept the business afloat. Over the next 10 years, despite all the struggles, it was during this period that Carl was able to show his true genius and made important developments and breakthroughs from his parallel experiments, especially for a two-stroke gasoline engine in 1879. To earn more income, he also began patenting his inventions, such as a system for regulating engine speed, ignition through a battery system, spark plug, carburetor, clutch, gear shifter, and a water radiator. With these designs, Carl not not only came closer to his dream of creating a horseless carriage, the production costs of Carl's company had risen so much that the banks demanded that he incorporate, and this forced him to partner with other investors and eventually convert his business into a limited company in 1882. In the end, Carl was left with only 5% of the shares, and therefore his position in the company was downgraded. To make matters worse, his ideas were no longer taken into account when the company designed new products. In fact, he no longer had any say in the company's business. The company. Frustrated and hurt with this arrangement, Carl packed up his things and left the corporation the following year. Leaving his company was a hard blow for Carl, but the disappointment made him even more determined to succeed. His lifelong passion for bicycles would lead him to Max Rose and Friedrich Wilhelm, two men who owned a bicycle repair shop in Mannheim. Together they established Benz and concentrated on the manufacture of industrial machines and stationary gas engines. Unlike Carl's previous company, this one started out, Carl Benz finally turned his main focus to his lifelong dream of building an automobile with his gasoline engine rather than simply adding an engine to a car. Carl built the car around the engine, and using technology similar to that of a bicycle, he built what many considered to be the first true automobile. In 1885, the Benz Patent-Motorwagen, this two-seater vehicle, rode on three wire wheels forming a tricycle, and was powered by a four-stroke gasoline engine. Carl knew this was revolutionary, and after testing and refining his vehicle, he drove his marvelous automobile to the public in the summer of 1886. However, it received mixed reviews. While some admired this creation, most people were skeptical about the machine and did not want it to drive on the main streets for fear it would explode. Others were convinced that Carl was himself driving the carriage. Carl's business partners were not so happy either. Their obsession with the automobile kept him away from his work, and they could not see how his invention could be useful. Why anyone would buy such a machine? They argued that it was no faster than a horse, it could easily break down and run out of fuel. However, Carl Benz was convinced that his horseless carriage was the future and started making cars for sale in 1888, thus becoming the first person in the world to do so. His biggest supporter was his wife, who often stayed with him in the workshop for the first time. Carl's vision, on the other hand, the few who bought the cars could only use them to cover short distances, and even then they needed mechanics to be with them at all times. It also didn't help that they were very expensive, so they were only accessible to the rich or the elite, and even the so-called elite didn't like them because they were too noisy and messy. Having said that, one thing was clear: Carl needed to convince the world that the automobile was here to stay. Had come to stay. Music. One morning in the summer of 1888, Bertha Benz got up very early while Carl was still in bed and got into her husband's car to embark on one of the most important journeys in the history of the automobile. She brought her two children and set out to visit her mother in Fareham, which was an extremely far 66 miles from Mannheim. Bertha did not inform her husband or the police about her plans, probably because if they had found out they would not have let her go at that time. No automobile or motor carriage had ever attempted such a long journey before, but she was determined to show the importance of the Benz invention. However, this trip was not like a walk in the park. Bertha faced many problems, such as crossing dusty and stony roads that were meant for horses, having to go through one to get gas, and even having to make some mechanical repairs along the way. The 66-mile trip took Bertha and her two sons approximately 12 hours of travel, but in the end that trip achieved the goal Bertha had set out to make: the point that the automobile had come to stay with us. The Benz Motorwagen became the talk of the town and received great publicity for Carl's business. Very soon Benz began to expand rapidly, so much so that by 1890 it became the second largest motor manufacturer in Germany, although not by selling cars, but by its stationary gasoline engines. But with the addition of two business partners, Friedrich von Fischer and Julius Ganz, would help change this as they took care of the business and marketing side of things. Benz was able to concentrate more on the engineering and was able to patent new automobile innovations such as the planetary gear transmission, the double pivot steering, and the flat engine with the boxer configuration. He also designed and manufactured a new and improved automobile on the recommendation of his business partners that went on sale in 1893. He called it the Benz Victoria. This was a more luxurious two-passenger vehicle that came with a 3-horsepower engine capable of reaching 11 miles per hour thanks to its reliability. This is later designed the more economical Benz Velo. Benz Velo became the world's first large-scale production automobile in history, which made Benz the largest automotive company in the world during the 1890s and early 20th century. However, although the Benz company enjoyed a lot of success, it also felt a lot of pressure from another company that was located not far away, Daimler Motor and Gesellschaft. Daimler Motor and Gesellschaft was run by Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach, both of whom were brilliant engineers. But Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were both brilliant engineers. But Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were both brilliant engineers. But Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were both brilliant engineers. But Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were both brilliant engineers. But Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were both brilliant engineers. Were brilliant engineers. But Gottlieb Daimler in particular was known to be very competitive and had many connections and knowledge in terms of business, something that Carl Benz seemed to lack. The first Daimler automobile to be sold commercially appeared in 1892. 2 years later they followed with their first front-engine model, that Daimler Phoenix. It was clear that the Daimler company was catching up with Benz as their vehicles looked more attractive and comfortable to the public. However, Mr. Daimler would pass away sadly in 1900, leaving Maybach in charge of the company. But it was under Maybach's control that he designed his greatest achievement, the 35-horsepower Mercedes, in 1901. What makes this vehicle so special is that it was the first automobile to look or resemble our modern idea of an automobile. It was equipped with a powerful gasoline engine. The body was wider and larger with a custom steel chassis, and its center mass was close to the ground. Initially built for racing, this vehicle was manufactured accordingly at the request of a wealthy businessman, Emil Jelinek, who decided to name the car after his daughter Mercedes. This car would win multiple street races and mountain events, reaching a top speed of 56 mph, higher than any other vehicle of the time. This appealed a lot to the Daimler company, who decided to rebrand all their vehicles to Mercedes and started producing new models for racing and public use with the same name. However, on the other hand, this new trend did not sit well with the Carl Benz partners, who wanted an immediate response to counter their competition. Made that decision. He never liked the idea of racing cars and always preferred to drive slowly and carefully. He was horrified by the noise and the danger of someone driving at high speed on public roads. The car built by his team was not a success either, and this became detrimental to the Benz company, which went through a crisis between 1903 and 1904. Angry and disappointed, Carl decided to leave his company, although he still remained on the board of directors. In the end, he agreed to allow his cars to compete, and it was the success of the races that eventually rescued his company. In 198, Benz had a 120-horsepower racing car, a monster that roared from Leningrad to Moscow in 8.5 hours with an average speed of 50 miles per hour. This was an incredible feat considering how primitive the roads were at the time, but it was the 200-horsepower Benz Blitzen Benz that put the brand in the limelight. Built in 1909, this race car would break the absolute speed record achieved by any plane, train, or automobile at that time, exceeding 140 miles per hour in 1911. This placed Benz alongside Daimler as one of the most desired cars at that time, and both companies enjoyed good sales in the following years. However, this was short-lived, as the outbreak of the First World War would shake people's lives and the global economy. With that defeat of Germany in the First World War, the country went through an economic recession. Both Daimler and Benz companies ended up fighting immensely to strengthen their chances of survival. They put aside their rivalry and signed an agreement with Daimler and Benz. their rivalry and signed an agreement in 1924 in which they agreed to combine their production and marketing efforts, keeping their individual names to save costs. But this agreement only lasted 2 years. The German economy worsened and the two companies were forced to merge completely in 1926, creating a new company called Daimler-Benz. Under Daimler-Benz, the company renamed its vehicles as Mercedes-Benz and launched several impressive models in the late 1920s, such as the Mercedes-Benz Type 630 model SSS and SSK. One of its main and most brilliant engineers who helped develop these vehicles was Ferdinand Porsche, whose name would become famous in the automobile industry as Carl remained on the board of Daimler-Benz and was able to see the success of his cars and was amazed and pleased with how far the industry had come. Sadly, he passed away shortly after the merger of the company in April 1929 at the age of 84 years. After his death, the company continued to grow in size and strength, becoming one of the best automobile manufacturers in its best years under an unlikely protagonist. Music Adolf. When he came to power in Germany in 1903, he wanted to show German engineering and technology to the whole world with the aim of having his political point of view above all others. One way he decided to impress the world was by exhibiting German cars in international motorsports. Almost immediately he gave a large subsidy to Daimler-Benz to participate in Grand Prix racing. No other car company at that time would have spent as much time and money on building fast cars as Daimler-Benz, and this was the first time that Daimler-Benz was able to do this. Daimler-Benz, and this was evident on the racetrack from 1934 to 1939. Mercedes dominated the Grand Prix races, driving at speeds of up to 200 mph with their W25 and W125 models. However, they were also challenged by a new rival, Union, another German car manufacturer sponsored by their own country. Union would continue to have their fair share of success during the same period, winning 25 races between 1935 and 1937. These successes placed Germany on top of the world with motorsport events, especially Mercedes-Benz, who even became the preferred car brand, in fact one of the world's most successful automobile manufacturers. In fact, one of the cars he was often seen in was the Mercedes-Benz 770, a large luxury vehicle used mainly by high-ranking Nazi politicians and other Axis officials. However, with the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Daimler-Benz company would soon find itself in great danger as demand for civilian passenger cars became scarce. They began to manufacture military vehicles, submarines, tanks and aircraft engines for the Nazi army. Their major line of business was military trucks capable of supplying from 3 to 6 tons. By 1942 they stopped producing public mobiles altogether, as all resources were directed towards the war, and as the war intensified, new personnel were needed to handle the increased armament production of the entire workforce was now fighting in the war. Daimler-Benz recruited women to cope with the volumes of units required. However, this was not enough to meet demand, so the company resorted to forced labor. These prisoners of war were civilians kidnapped and detained from camps and forced to work in the war. Most of these workers came from Eastern Europe, who were interned in barrack camps with poor prison-like surroundings, while concentration camp detainees were supervised by the SS Protection Squad in inhumane living conditions. Many people died in these camps either from severe malnutrition, mistreatment, or even torture, and by 1944 almost half of the 63,000 Daimler-Benzler employees were forced to work long hours under immense pressure from the Germans. After the war ended in 1945, the company received a big blow due to the Potsdam Agreement. All German assets abroad were confiscated and used for reparation payments. This led Daimler-Benz to lose all of its affiliated subsidiaries and branches abroad, and they were reduced to their own plants in their home country and other countries. The company was forced to sell its assets to the SS. In other words, they had to restart and turn their way up again. First of all, the company was restructured and noticeably stripped from its top management. Because of these drastic changes, the company was able to obtain a production permit from the U.S. occupation authorities in 1946. Although its factories suffered severe damage from Mercedes-Benz bombs, it still had the advantage of owning the company's own plants. Benz still had the advantage of owning its own plant, as many other competitors such as BMW or Adler had lost their sights by ending up in Soviet territory. The Mercedes-Benz company then focused its efforts on producing ambulances, police patrol vehicles and delivery vans based on its 170B models, and used one of its plants as a repair center for U.S. military vehicles. In 1947, they went to produce passenger cars with only 1,445 170B cars produced that year. But even in a less than ideal financial situation, Daimler-Benz managed to turn a profit just 1 year later. In the 1950s, Mercedes its control by making a strong comeback in motorsport events as well as successful sales worldwide, so much so that by 1954 the company had already made a profit of over $1 billion a year. Over the years, Mercedes has completely changed its image and has become one of the most valuable car brands in the world. However, all this would not have been possible without Carl Benz, who despite his humble beginnings had the courage, challenges and criticism and determination to turn his dream into reality. And if you want to see another fascinating story like this, click on this subscribe and like us. See you. Bye bye.